May 1926. By the beginning of the month, Pamela, off her crutches and back to playing tennis, had learned that she had failed her Cambridge exam. "I panicked," she said. "I saw questions I didn't know, and I went to pieces and flunked it. I should have swat more, or if I'd just stayed calm and thought it through I could probably have made a good fist of it." "There are other universities if you're so set on being a bluestocking," Sylvie said. Sylvie, although she never quite came out and said it, thought academia was pointless for girls. After all, woman's highest calling is to be a mother and a wife. "You'd have me slave over a hot stove rather than a Bunsen burner. What did science ever do for the world, apart from make better ways of killing people?" Sylvie said. "Well, it's a crying shame about Cambridge," Hugh said. "Maurice is set to get a first and he's a complete dolt." To make up for Pamela's disappointment, he bought her a Raleigh loop-frame roadster, and Teddy asked what he would get if he failed an exam. Hugh laughed and said, "Careful, that's Augustus talk." "Oh please, don't," Teddy said, mortified at any mention of the book. The Adventures of Augustus had, to everyone's chagrin but particularly Teddy's, proved a roaring success, flying off the bookshelves and reprinted 3 times so far, according to Izzy, who had already earned a fat little royalty check and moved into a flat in Ovington Square. She had also done an interview for a newspaper in which she mentioned her prototype, her charming rogue of a nephew. "But not my name," Teddy said, hanging on to hope. He got a conciliation gift from Izzy in the shape of a new dog. Trixie had died a few weeks previously, and Teddy had been in mourning ever since. The new dog was a Westie, like Augustus's dog, not a breed that any of them would have chosen. He had already been christened by Izzy Jock, naturally, the name engraved on the tag on his expensive collar. Sylvie suggested changing his name to Pilot, Charlotte Bronte's dog, she said to Ursula. One day, Ursula said to Pamela, "My communion with our mother will consist entirely of the names of the great writers of the past," and Pamela said, "I think it probably already does." The little dog already answered to Jock, and it seemed wrong to confuse him, so Jock he remained, and in time they all grew to love him best of any of their dogs despite his annoying provenance. Maurice turned up on a Saturday morning, this time with only Howie in tow and no sign of Gilbert, who had been sent down for an indiscretion. When Pamela said, "What indiscretion?" Sylvie said that it was the definition of an indiscretion that you didn't speak of it afterwards. Ursula had thought of Howie quite often since their last encounter. It was not so much the physical. Howie, the Oxford bags, the soft-collared shirt, the brilliantined hair, but the fact that he had been thoughtful enough to try to find Teddy's lost ball. Being kind modified the extraordinary, alarming otherness of him, which was threefold: large, male, and American. Despite her ambivalent feelings, she couldn't help but experience a slight thrill when she saw him hop effortlessly out of his open-top car, parked outside the front door of Fox Corner. "Hey," he said when he caught sight of her, and she realized her imaginary beau didn't even know her name. A pot of coffee and a plate of scones were hastily conjured up by Sylvie and Bridget. "We're not staying," Maurice said to Sylvie, who said, "Thank goodness, I don't have enough to stretch to feed 2 hulking young men." "We're going up to London to help out with the strike," Maurice said. Hugh expressed surprise. He hadn't realized, he said, that Morris's politics put him on the side of the workers, and Maurice in turn expressed surprise that his father could even think this was the case. They were going to drive buses and trains, and whatever else it took to keep the country running. "I didn't know you knew how to drive a train, Maurice," Teddy said, suddenly finding his brother interesting. "Well, a stoker, then," Maurice said irritably. "It can't be that difficult." "They're not called stokers, they're called firemen," Pamela said, "and it's a very skilled job. Ask your friend Smithy." A remark which for some reason got Maurice even hotter under the collar. "You're trying to shore up a civilization that's in its death throes," Hugh said, as casually as if he were remarking on the weather. "There's really no point." Ursula left the room at this juncture. If there was one thing she found more tedious than thinking about politics, it was talking about politics. And then, astonishing. Again. As she was skipping up the back stairs on her way to the attic bedroom to fetch something innocent, a book, a handkerchief, afterwards she would never remember what, she was almost sent flying by Howie on his way down. "I was looking for a bathroom," he said. "Well, we only have one," Ursula said, "and it's not up these," but before the sentence was finished she found herself pinned awkwardly against the neglected floral wallpaper of the back stairs, a pattern that had been up since the house was built. "Pretty girl," he said. His breath smelt of mint. And then she was again subjected to pushing and shoving from the outsized Howie. But this time it was not his tongue trying to jam its way into her mouth, but something inexpressibly more intimate. She tried to say something, but before a sound came out his hand clamped over her mouth, over half her face in fact, and he grinned and said, "SSH," as if they were conspirators in a game. With his other hand he was fiddling with her clothes, and she squealed in protest. Then he was butting up against her, the way the bullocks in the lower field did against the gate. She tried to struggle, but he was twice, 3 times her size even, and she might as well have been a mouse in Hattie's jaws. She tried to see what he was doing, but he was pressed so tightly against her that all she could see was his big square jaw, and the slight brush of stubble, unnoticeable from a distance. Ursula had seen her brothers naked, knew what they had between their legs, wrinkled cockles, a little spout, and it seemed to have little to do with this painful piston-driven thing that was now ramming inside her like a weapon of war. Her own body breached. The arch that led to womanhood did not seem so triumphal anymore, merely brutal and completely uncaring. And then Howie gave a great bellow, more ox than Oxford man, and was hitching himself back together and grinning at her. "English girls," he said, shaking his head and laughing. He wagged his finger at her, almost disapproving, as if she had engineered the disgusting thing that had just happened, and said, "You really are something." He laughed again and bounded down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, as though his descent had been barely interrupted by their strange tryst. Ursula was left to stare at the floral wallpaper. She had never noticed before that the flowers were wisteria, the same flower that grew on the arch over the back porch. This must be what in literature was referred to as deflowering, she thought. It had always sounded like a rather pretty word. When she came back downstairs a half hour later, a half hour of thoughts and emotions considerably more intense than was usual for a Saturday morning, Sylvie and Hugh were on the doorstep waving a dutiful goodbye to the disappearing rear end of Howie's car. "Thank goodness they weren't staying," Sylvie said. "I don't think I could have been bothered with Morris's bluster." "Imbeciles," Hugh said cheerfully. "All right," he said, catching sight of Ursula in the hallway. "Yes," she said. Any other answer would have been too awful. Ursula found it easier than she had expected to lock this occurrence away. After all, hadn't Sylvie herself said that the definition of an indiscretion was that you didn't speak of it afterwards? Ursula imagined a cupboard in her mind, a corner one, in simple pitch pine. Howie and the back stairs were put on a high shelf and the key was firmly turned in the lock. A girl surely should know better than to be caught on those back stairs, or in the shrubbery, like the heroine in a Gothic novel, the kind that Bridget was so fond of. But who would have suspected that the reality of it would be so sordid and bloody? He must have sensed something in her, something unchaste, that even she was unaware of. Before locking it away she had gone over the incident again and again, trying to see in what way she had been to blame. There must be something written on her skin, in her face, that some people could read and others couldn't. Izzy had seen it. Something wicked this way comes. And the something was herself. The summer unrolled. Pamela was given a place at Leeds University to read chemistry, and said she was glad because people would be more straightforward in the provinces and not as snobbish. She played a lot of tennis with Gertie and championship mixed doubles with Daniel Cole and his brother Simon, and often let Ursula borrow her bike so that she could go for long rides with Millie, both of them shrieking as they freewheeled down hills. Sometimes Ursula went for lazy walks through the lanes with Teddy and Jimmy, Jock running rings around them. Neither Teddy nor Jimmy seemed to need to keep their lives secret from their sisters in the way that Maurice had done. Pamela and Ursula took Teddy and Jimmy up to London for day trips, to the Natural History Museum, to the British Museum, to Kew, but they never told Izzy when they were in town. She had moved yet again, to a large house in Holland Park, a rather artistic endroit. One day as they wandered along Piccadilly they spied a pile of The Adventures of Augustus in a bookshop window, accompanied by a photograph of the author, Miss Delphi Fox, taken by Mr. Cecil Beaton, in which Izzy looked like a film star or a society beauty. "Oh God," Teddy said, and Pamela, despite being in loco parentis, didn't correct his language. There was a fete once more in the grounds of Ettringham Hall. The Daunts had gone, after 1,000 years, Lady Daunt never having recovered from the murder of little Angela, and the hall was now owned by a rather mysterious man, a Mr. Lambert, who some said was Belgian, some Scottish, but no one had had a long enough conversation with him to discover his origins. Rumor said he had made his fortune during the war, but everyone reported him shy and difficult to talk to. There were dances, too, in the village hall on Friday evenings, and at one of these Fred Smith appeared, scrubbed clean of his daily soot, and asked, in turn, Pamela, Ursula, and the 3 eldest Shawcrosses to dance. There was a gramophone, not a band, and they danced only old-fashioned dances, no Charleston or Black Bottom, and it was pleasant to be waltzed safely around the room, with surprising skill, by Fred Smith. Ursula thought it would be rather nice to have someone like Fred as a beau, although obviously Sylvie would never have tolerated such a thing. A railwayman. As soon as she thought about Fred in this way, the cupboard door sprang open, and the whole appalling scene on the back stairs tumbled out. "Steady on," Fred Smith said, "you've gone a bit green round the gills, Miss Todd," and Ursula had to blame it on the heat, and insist on taking some fresh air on her own. She had in fact been feeling quite queasy lately. Sylvie put it down to a summer cold. Maurice had gained his expected first, how? Pamela puzzled, and came home for a few weeks to lounge around before taking up a place in chambers in Lincoln's Inn, to train as a barrister. Howie, apparently, had returned to his people at their summer home on Long Island Sound. Maurice seemed a little miffed that he had not been invited to join them. "What happened to you?" Maurice said to Ursula one afternoon, as he sprawled on a deck chair on the lawn reading Punch, cramming nearly an entire slice of Mrs. Glover's marmalade cake into his mouth at once. "What do you mean, what happened to me?" "You've turned into a heifer." A heifer. It was true she was filling out her summer frocks rather alarmingly, even her hands and feet seemed to have plumped up. "Puppy fat, dear," Sylvie said, "even I had it. Less cake and more tennis, that's the remedy." "You look hellish," Pamela said to her, "what's wrong with you?" "I have no idea," Ursula said. And then something truly terrible dawned on her, so awful, so shameful, so irretrievable, that she felt something catch fire and burn inside her at the very thought. She hunted down Sylvie's copy of The Teaching of Young Children and Girls as to Reproduction by Dr. Beatrice Webb, which, theoretically, Sylvie kept under lock and key in a chest in her bedroom, but the chest was never locked because Sylvie had long ago lost the key. Reproduction seemed to be the last thing on the author's mind. She advised distracting young girls by giving them plenty of homemade bread, cake, porridge, puddings and cold water splashed regularly onto the parts. It was clearly no help. Ursula shuddered at the memory of Howie's parts, and how they had come together with hers in one vile conjugation. Was this what Sylvie and Hugh did? She couldn't imagine her mother putting up with such a thing. She sneaked a look at Mrs. Shawcross's medical encyclopedia. The Shawcrosses were on holiday in Norfolk, but their maid thought nothing of it when Ursula appeared at the back door saying she had come to look at a book. The encyclopedia explained the mechanics of the sexual act, something which appeared to take place only within the loving confines of the marital bed, rather than on the back stairs when you were on your way to fetch a handkerchief, a book. The encyclopedia also detailed the consequences of failing to retrieve that handkerchief, that book, the missed monthlies, the sickness, the weight gain. It took 9 months apparently. And now they were already well into July. Before long she would be squeezing herself back into her navy blue gym slip, and catching the bus to school every morning with Millie. Ursula began to take long solitary walks. There was no Millie to confide in, and would she have anyway, and Pamela had decamped to Devon with her Girl Guide patrol. Ursula had never taken to the guides, now she rather regretted that they might have given her the gumption to deal with Howie. A guide would have retrieved that handkerchief, that book, without being hindered on the journey. "Is there anything the matter, dear?" Sylvie asked as they darned stockings together. Sylvie's children only really came into focus for her when in isolation. Together they were an unwieldy flock, singly they had character. Ursula imagined what she could say. "You remember Morris's friend Howie? I appear to be the mother of his child." She glanced at Sylvie, serenely wefting and warping her little woolen patch on the hole in the toe of one of Teddy's socks. She did not look like a woman who had had her parts breached. A vagina, apparently, according to Mrs. Shawcross's encyclopedia, not a word that had ever been uttered in the Todds household. "No, nothing at all," Ursula said. "I'm fine. Absolutely fine." That afternoon she walked to the station and sat on a bench on the platform, and contemplated throwing herself under the express when it came hurtling through, but the next train turned out to be for London, huffing slowly to a halt in front of her in a way that seemed so familiar that it made her want to cry. She spotted Fred Smith climbing down from the cab, oily overalls and face smutty with coal dust. Spotting her, he came over and said, "Here's a coincidence, are you catching our train?" "I haven't got a ticket," Ursula said. "That's all right," Fred said, nod and a wink from me, "and the ticket inspector'll see a friend of mine all right." Was she a friend of Fred Smith? It was comforting to think so. Of course, if he knew about her condition he would no longer be a friend. No one would. "Yes, all right, thank you," she said. Not having a ticket seemed such a little problem. She watched Fred climb back into the cab of his locomotive. The station master stalked along the platform, slamming the carriage doors with a finality that suggested they would never be opened again. Steam flared from the funnel and Fred Smith stuck his head out of the cab and shouted, "Look smart there, Miss Todd, or you'll be left behind," and she stepped obediently on board. The station master's whistle chirped, short at first and then a longer call, and the train shuffled out of the station. Ursula sat on the warm plush of the seats and contemplated the future. She supposed she could get lost among the other fallen women crying woe on the streets of London. Curl up on a park bench and freeze to death overnight, except that it was the height of summer, and she was unlikely to freeze. Or wade into the Thames and drift gently on the tide, past Wapping and Rotherhithe and Greenwich, and on to Tilbury and out to sea. How puzzled her family would be if her drowned body was hooked from the deep. She imagined Sylvie, frowning over her darning, but she only went for a walk. She said she was going to pick the wild raspberries in the lane. Ursula thought guiltily of the white china pudding basin she had abandoned in the hedgerow, intending to collect it on her return. It was half full of the sour little berries, and her fingers were still stained red. She spent the afternoon walking through the great parks of London, through St. James's and Green Park, past the Palace and into Hyde Park, and on to Kensington Gardens. It was extraordinary how far you could go in London and barely touch a pavement or cross a road. She had no money on her, of course, a ridiculous mistake, she realized now, and couldn't even buy a cup of tea in Kensington. There was no Fred Smith here to see her all right. She was hot and tired and dusty and felt as parched as the grass in Hyde Park. Could you drink the water in the Serpentine? Shelley's first wife had drowned herself here, but Ursula supposed that on a day like this, crowds of people enjoying the sunshine, it would be almost impossible to avoid another Mr. Winton jumping in and rescuing her. She knew where she was going, of course. It was inevitable somehow. "Good God, what happened to you?" Izzy said, throwing her front door wide dramatically, as if she had been expecting someone more interesting. "You look a fright." "I've been walking all afternoon," Ursula said. "I have no money," she added. "And I think I'm going to have a baby." "You'd better come in then," Izzy said. And now here she was, sitting on an uncomfortable chair in a large house in Belgravia, in what must have once been the dining room. Now devoid of any purpose except waiting, it was nondescript. The Dutch still life above the fireplace and the bowl of dusty-looking chrysanthemums on a Pembroke table provided no clue as to what might happen elsewhere in the house. It was hard to connect any of this to the odious rendezvous with Howie on the back stairs. Who would have thought it could be so easy to slip from one life to another? Ursula wondered what Dr. Kellett would have made of her predicament. After her unexpected arrival in Melbury Road, Izzy had put her to bed in her spare bedroom, and Ursula had lain sobbing beneath the shiny satin cover, trying not to listen to Izzy's unlikely lies on the phone in the hallway. "I know. She just turned up on the doorstep, the lamb, wanted to see me. Pay a visit, museums and so on, the theatre, nothing risque, now don't be a termagant, Hugh." It was just as well that Izzy hadn't spoken to Sylvie, she would have been given short shrift there. The upshot was that she was to be allowed to stay for a few days for museums and so on. Phone call finished, Izzy came into the bedroom carrying a tray. "Brandy," she said. "And buttered toast. All I could rustle up at short notice, I'm afraid." "You are such a fool," she sighed. "There are ways, you know, things that one can do, prevention better than cure and so on." Ursula had no idea what Izzy was talking about. "And you must get rid of it," Izzy continued. "We are agreed on that, aren't we?" A question which produced a heartfelt yes from Ursula. A woman in a nurse's uniform opened the door of the Belgravia waiting room and looked in. Her uniform was so starched it would have stood up quite well without her inside it. "This way," she said stiffly, without addressing Ursula by name. Ursula followed as meek as a lamb to the slaughter. Izzy, efficient rather than sympathetic, had dropped her off in the car, good luck, with a promise that she would return later. Ursula had no idea what was to happen in the interim between Izzy's good luck and her later, but she presumed it would be unpleasant. A foul-tasting syrup, or a kidney dish full of large pills perhaps. And undoubtedly a good talking to about her morals and her character. She hardly cared, as long as in the end the clock could be put back. How big was the baby, she wondered? Her brief research in the Shawcross's encyclopedia had given few clues. She supposed it would come out with a certain amount of difficulty, and be wrapped in a shawl before being placed in a cradle, and tended carefully until it was ready to be given to a nice couple who longed to have a baby as much as Ursula longed not to have one. And then she would be able to catch the train home, walk along Church Lane, and retrieve the white china bowl with its harvest of raspberries, before entering Fox Corner, as if nothing had happened beyond museums and so on. It was a room like any other really. There were curtains swagged and tasseled at the tall windows. The curtains looked as though they were left over from the previous life of the house, as did the marble fireplace that now held a gas fire, and on the mantelpiece, a plain-faced clock with large numbers. The green linoleum underfoot, and the operating table in the middle of the room, were equally incongruous. The room smelt like the science laboratory at school. Ursula wondered about the brutish array of shining metal instruments that were laid out on a linen cloth on a trolley. They seemed to have more to do with butchery than babies. There was no sign of a cradle waiting anywhere. Her heart began to flutter. A man, older than Hugh, in a long white doctor's smock hurried into the room, as if he were on his way somewhere else, and ordered Ursula up onto the operating table with her feet in the stirrups. "Stirrups," Ursula repeated. Surely horses were not involved. The request was baffling until the starched nurse pushed her down and hooked her feet up. "I'm having an operation," Ursula protested. "But I'm not ill." The nurse placed a mask over her face. "Count from 10 down to 1, she said. "Why?" Ursula tried to ask, but the word had barely formed in her brain before the room, and everything in it disappeared. The next thing she knew she was in the passenger seat of Izzy's Austin, gazing woozily through the windscreen. "You'll be right as rain in no time," Izzy said. "Don't worry, they've doped you up. You'll feel queer for a bit. How did Izzy know so much about this appalling process? Back in Melbury Road, Izzy helped her into bed, and she slept deeply beneath the shiny satin cover in the spare bedroom. It was dark outside when Izzy came in with a tray. "Oxtail soup," she said cheerfully. "I got it from a tin." Izzy smelt of alcohol, something sweet and cloying, and underneath her makeup and her bright demeanor she looked exhausted. Ursula supposed she must be a terrible burden to her. She struggled to sit up. The smell of the alcohol and the oxtail was too much and she vomited all over the shiny satin. "Oh God," Izzy said, holding her hand over her mouth. "I'm really not cut out for this kind of thing." "What happened to the baby?" Ursula asked. "What? What happened to the baby?" Ursula repeated. "Did they give it to someone nice?" She woke in the night and vomited again, and fell back to sleep without either cleaning it up or calling out to Izzy. When she woke in the morning she was too hot. Far too hot. Her heart was knocking in her chest and each breath was hard to come by. She tried to get out of bed but her head was swimming, and her legs wouldn't hold her. After that everything was a blur. Izzy must have called Hugh because she felt a cool hand on her clammy forehead, and when she opened her eyes he was smiling reassuringly at her. He was sitting on the bed, still in his overcoat. She was sick all over it. "We'll get you to a hospital," he said, unperturbed by the mess. "You've got a bit of an infection." Somewhere in the background Izzy was putting up a fierce protest. "I'll be prosecuted," she hissed at Hugh, and Hugh said, "Good, I hope they put you in jail and throw away the key." He lifted Ursula up in his arms and said, "Quicker to take the Bentley, I think." Ursula felt weightless, as if she was going to float away. The next thing she knew she was on a cavernous hospital ward and Sylvie was there, her face tight and awful. "How could you?" she said. She was glad when evening came and Sylvie changed places with Hugh. It was Hugh who was with her when the black bat came. The hand of night was held out to her and Ursula rose to meet it. She was relieved, almost glad. She could feel the shining, luminous world beyond calling, the place where all the mysteries would be revealed. The darkness enveloped her, a velvet friend. Snow was in the air, as fine as talcum, as icy as the east wind on a baby's skin, but then Ursula fell back into the hospital bed, her hand rejected. There was a brilliant slant of light across the pale green of the hospital counterpane. Hugh was asleep, his face slack and tired. He was sitting in an awkward position in a chair next to the bed. One trouser leg had ridden up slightly and Ursula could see a wrinkled grey lisle sock and the smooth skin of her father's shin. He had once been like Teddy, she thought, and one day Teddy would be like him. The boy within the man within the boy. It made her want to weep. Hugh opened his eyes, and when he saw her he smiled weakly and said, "Hello, little bear. Welcome back." August 1926. The pen should be held lightly, and in such a manner as to permit of the shorthand characters being easily written. The wrist must not be allowed to rest on the notebook or desk. The rest of the summer was wretched. She sat beneath the apple trees in the orchard and tried to read a Pitman's shorthand instruction book. It had been decided she would do a typing and shorthand course rather than return to school. "I can't go back," she said. "I just can't." There was little escape from the chill that Sylvie brought with her every time she entered a room and discovered Ursula in it. Both Bridget and Mrs. Glover were puzzled as to why the serious illness that Ursula had contracted in London while staying with her, and seemed to have made Sylvie so distant from her daughter, when they might have expected the opposite. Izzy, of course, was barred forever. Persona non grata in perpetuum. No one knew the truth of what had happened except for Pamela, who had wormed the whole story out of Ursula, bit by bit. "But he forced himself on you," she fumed. "How can you think it was your fault?" "But the consequences," Ursula murmured. Sylvie blamed her entirely, of course. "You've thrown away your virtue, your character, everyone's good opinion of you. But no one knows." "I know. You sound like someone in one of Bridget's novels, Hugh said to Sylvie. Had Hugh read one of Bridget's novels? It seemed unlikely. In fact, Hugh said, you sound rather like my own mother. It seems dreadful now, Pamela said, but this too will pass. Even Millie was fooled by her lies. Blood poisoning, she said. How dramatic. Was hospital. Ghastly. Nancy said that Teddy told her that you nearly died. I'm sure nothing so exciting will ever happen to me. What a world of difference there was between dying and nearly dying. One's whole life, in fact. Ursula felt she had no use for the life she had been saved for. I'd like to see Dr. Kellett again, she said to Sylvie. He's retired, I believe, Sylvie said indifferently. Ursula still wore her hair long, mostly to please Hugh, but one day she went into Beaconsfield with Millie and had her hair chopped short. It was a penitent act that made her feel rather like a martyr or a nun. She supposed that was how she would live out the rest of her life, somewhere between the two. Hugh seemed surprised rather than saddened. She supposed a haircut was a mild travesty compared to Belgravia. Good gracious, he said, when she sat down at the dinner table to unappetizing veal cutlets à la Russe. Looks like the dog's dinner, Jimmy said, although Jimmy, a boy of magnificent appetite, would have quite happily eaten Jock's dinner. You look like a completely different person, Hugh said. That can only be a good thing, can't it? Ursula said. I like the old Ursula, Teddy said. Well, it seems as though you're the only one who does, Ursula muttered. Sylvie made a noise that fell short of a word and Hugh said to Ursula, oh, come, I think you're, but she never did find out what Hugh thought of her because the loud rapping of the front door knocker announced a rather anxious Major Shawcross inquiring as to whether Nancy was with them. Sorry to interrupt your dinner, he said, hovering in the doorway of the dining room. She isn't here, Hugh said, although Nancy's absence was obvious. Major Shawcross frowned at the cutlets on their plates. She went to gather some leaves in the lane, he said. For her scrapbook. You know what she's like. This addressed to Teddy, Nancy's twin soul. Nancy loved nature, forever collecting twigs and pine cones, shells and stones and bones, like the totems of an ancient religion. A child of nature, Mrs. Shawcross called her, as if that were a good thing, Sylvie said. She wanted oak leaves, Major Shawcross said. We don't have any oaks in our garden. There was a short discussion about the demise of the English oak, followed by a thoughtful silence. Major Shawcross cleared his throat. She's been gone about an hour, according to Roberta. I've walked the length of the lane, up and back, shouting her name. I can't think where she might be. Winnie and Millie are out searching as well. Major Shawcross was beginning to look rather sick. Sylvie poured a glass of water and handed it to him. Sit down, she said. He didn't. Of course, Ursula thought he was thinking of Angela. I expect she'll have found something interesting, Hugh said, a bird's nest or a farm cat with kittens. You know what she's like. They were all now quite in agreement that they knew what Nancy was like. Major Shawcross picked up a spoon from the dining room table and gazed at it absently. She's missed her dinner. I'll come and help you look for her, Teddy said, jumping up from the table. He knew what Nancy was like too, knew she never missed her dinner. Me too, Hugh said, giving Major Shawcross an encouraging pat on the back, the veal cutlets abandoned. Shall I come? Ursula asked. No, Sylvie said. Nor Jimmy either. Stay here, we'll look in the gardens. No ice house this time. A hospital mortuary for Nancy. Still warm and soft when they found her, pushed into an empty old cattle trough. Interfered with, Hugh told Sylvie while Ursula lurked like a spy behind the morning room door. 2 little girls in 3 years, it can't be a coincidence, can it? Strangled like Angela before her. A monster is living among us, Sylvie said. It was Major Shawcross who found her. Thank God, it wasn't poor old Ted this time, Hugh said. He couldn't have borne it. Teddy couldn't bear it anyway. He barely spoke for weeks. His soul had been cut away, he said, when he did eventually speak. Scars heal, Sylvie said. Even the worst ones. Do you think that's true? Ursula said, thinking about the wisteria wallpaper, the waiting room in Belgravia, and Sylvie said, well, not always, not even bothering to lie. They heard Mrs. Shawcross screaming all through the first night. Afterwards her face never looked right, and Dr. Fellows reported that she'd had a small stroke. Poor woman, Hugh said. She never knows where those girls are, Sylvie said. She just lets them run wild. Now she's paying the price of her carelessness. Oh, Sylvie, Hugh said sadly. Where is your heart? Pamela left for Leeds. Hugh drove her there in the Bentley. Her trunk was too massive for the boot, and had to be sent by train. Big enough to hide a body in, Pamela said. She was bound for a women's hall of residence, and had already been informed that she was to share the small room with a girl called Barbara, from Macclesfield. It'll be just like being at home, Teddy said encouragingly, except that Ursula will be someone else. Well, that rather makes it nothing like home, Pamela said. She clung to Ursula a little too fiercely before climbing into the car, and sitting next to Hugh. I can't wait to go, Pamela said to Ursula in bed on her last night, but I feel bad at leaving you. When she didn't go back to school for the autumn term, no one questioned Ursula's decision. Millie was too grief-stricken over Nancy's death to care much about anything. Ursula traveled on the train to High Wycombe every morning to attend a private secretarial college. College was a fancy word for 2 rooms, a cold scullery, and a colder cupboard containing a WC above a greengrocer's on the high street. The college was run by a man called Mr. Carver whose lifelong passions were Esperanto and Pitman shorthand, the latter more useful than the former. Ursula rather liked shorthand, it was akin to a secret code, with a whole new vocabulary, aspirates and shun hooks, compound consonants, special contractions, having and doubling, the language of neither the dead nor the living but the strangely inert. There was something soothing about listening to Mr. Carver's monotonous intonation of word lists, iterate, iteration, reiteration, reiterated, reiterating, prince, princely, princes, princess, princesses. The other girls on the course were all very pleasant and friendly, sanguine, practical sorts who always remembered their shorthand notebooks and rulers, and never had fewer than 2 different colored inks in their bags. At lunchtime when the weather was bad they stayed in, sharing their packed lunches and darning stockings among the banks of typewriters. They had spent their summer hiking and swimming and camping, and Ursula wondered if they could tell just by looking at her how different her own summer had been. Belgravia had become her shorthand for what had happened. An abortion, Pamela said. An illegal abortion. Pamela was never one to avoid a blunt vocabulary. Ursula very much wished that she would. She envied the ordinariness of their lives. How Izzy would scorn such an idea. Ursula's own chance at ordinariness seemed lost forever. What if she had thrown herself beneath the express train, or had died after Belgravia, or indeed, what if she were simply to open her bedroom window and throw herself out, head first? Would she really be able to come back and start again? Or was it, as everyone told her, and as she must believe, all in her head? And so what if it wasn't everything in her head real too? What if there was no demonstrable reality? What if there was nothing beyond the mind? Philosophers came to grips with this problem a long time ago, Dr. Kellett had told her, rather wearily. It was one of the very first questions they addressed, so there was really no point in her fretting over it. But surely, by its very nature, everyone wrestled with this dilemma anew every time. Forget typing, Pamela wrote from Leeds, you should read philosophy at university, you have the right kind of mind for it. Like a terrier with a terrifically tedious bone. She had, eventually, gone in search of Dr. Kellett and found his rooms occupied by a steel-haired, steel-spectacled woman who informed her that Dr. Kellett had indeed retired, and did she wish to make an appointment with herself? No, Ursula said she didn't. It was the first time she had been to London since Belgravia, and she had a panic attack on the Bakerloo line on the way back from Harley Street, and had to run out of the station at Marylebone, gasping for air. A newspaper seller said, "Are you all right, miss?" And she said, "Yes, yes, quite all right, thank you." Mr. Carver liked touching the girls, my girls, lightly on their shoulders, stroking the angora of a bolero cardigan, or the lamb's wool of a sweater, as if they were animals he was fond of. In the morning they practiced their typing skills on the big Underwoods. Sometimes Mr. Carver made them practice with blindfolds on, as this was, he claimed, the only way to stop them looking at the keys and slowing down their speeds. Wearing the blindfold made Ursula feel like a soldier about to be shot for desertion. On these occasions she often heard him making odd noises, muffled wheezes and grunts, but didn't like to peek from the blindfold to see what he might be doing. In the afternoons they did shorthand, soporific dictation exercises that encompassed every kind of business letter. "Dear Sir, I brought your letter before the Board of Directors at their meeting yesterday, but after some discussion they were obliged to postpone further consideration of the matter until the next directors' meeting, which will be held on the last Tuesday." The content of these letters was tedious in the extreme, and was a strange contrast to the furious flow of ink across their pads as they struggled to keep up. One afternoon, while he was dictating to them, "We fear there is no prospect of success for those who raise objection to the appointment," Mr. Carver passed behind Ursula, and gently touched the nape of her neck, no longer protected by long hair. A shiver rippled right through her. She stared at the keys of her Underwood on the table in front of her. Was it something in her that attracted this kind of attention? Was she not a good person? June 1932. Pamela had chosen a white brocade for herself and yellow satin for her bridesmaids. The yellow was on the acidic side and made all of the bridesmaids look slightly liverish. There were 4 of them: Ursula, Winnie Shawcross, chosen over Gertie, and Harold's 2 youngest sisters. Harold came from a large noisy family in the Old Kent Road that Sylvie considered to be inferior. The fact that Harold was a doctor didn't seem to mitigate his circumstances. Sylvie was curiously averse to the medical profession. "I thought your own family were somewhat déclassé, weren't they?" Hugh said to Sylvie. He liked his new son-in-law to be, found him refreshing. He liked Harold's mother, Olive, too. "She says what she means," he said to Sylvie. "And means what she says. Unlike some people." "I thought it looked nice in the pattern book," Pamela said doubtfully at Ursula's 3rd and final fitting, in a dressmaker's front room in Neasden, of all places. The bias-cut dress stretched tightly across Ursula's midriff. "You've put on weight since the last fitting," the dressmaker said. "Have I?" "Yes," Pamela said. Ursula thought of the last time she had put on weight. Belgravia. It was certainly not the reason this time. She was standing on a chair, the dressmaker moving in a circle around her, a pincushion attached to her wrist. "You still look nice though," Pamela added. I sit all day at my work," Ursula said. "I should walk more, I expect." It was so easy to be lazy. She lived on her own, but no one knew. Hilda, the girl she was supposed to share the flat with, a top floor in Bayswater, had moved out, although she still paid the rent, thank goodness. Hilda was living in Ealing in a regular little pleasure palace, with a man called Ernest whose wife wouldn't grant him a divorce, and she had to pretend to her parents that she was still in Bayswater, living the life of a single and virtuous woman. Ursula supposed it would only be a matter of time before Hilda's parents turned up unexpectedly on the doorstep, and she would have to spin a lie, or several, to explain their daughter's absence. Hugh and Sylvie would have been horrified if they thought Ursula was living on her own in London. Bayswater. Sylvie said doubtfully when Ursula announced she was moving out of Fox Corner. "Is that really necessary?" Hugh and Sylvie had vetted the flat, and they had also vetted Hilda, who stood up well to Sylvie's inquisition. Nonetheless, Sylvie found both the flat and Hilda somewhat wanting. Ernest from Ealing, as Ursula always thought of him, was the one who paid the rent, a kept woman. Hilda laughed, but Hilda herself came by every couple of weeks to pick up her post and pay the rent money over. I can find someone else to share with, Ursula offered, although she hated the idea. Let's wait a bit, Hilda said, see if it all works out for me. That's the beauty about living in sin, you can always just get up and leave. So can Ernest, from Ealing. I'm 21, he's 42, he's not about to leave, trust me. It had been a relief when Hilda had moved out. Ursula was able to lounge around all evening in her dressing gown, with her curlers in, eating oranges and chocolates and listening to the wireless. Not that Hilda would have objected to any of these things, would have enjoyed them in fact, but Sylvie had instilled decorum in the presence of others from an early age, and it was hard to shake it off. After a couple of weeks of being on her own, it struck her that she had hardly any friends, and those that she did have she never seemed to care enough about to keep in touch with. Millie had become an actress, and was away almost all the time with a touring theatre company. She sent the odd postcard from places she would probably never have visited otherwise, Stafford, Gateshead, Grantham, and drew funny cartoons of herself in various roles, me as Juliet, what a hoot. Their friendship hadn't really survived Nancy's death. The Shawcross family had turned inward with grief, and when Millie finally started to live her life again she found Ursula had stopped living hers. Ursula often wished that she could explain Belgravia to Millie, but didn't want to risk what was left of their fragile attachment. She worked for a big importing company, and sometimes when Ursula listened to the girls in the office chatting about what they'd been doing and with whom, she found herself wondering how on earth they met all these people, these Gordons, Charlies, Dicks, Mildreds, Eileens and Veras, a gay, restless flock with whom they frequented variety palaces and cinemas, went skating, swam in Lidos and baths and drove out to Epping Forest and Eastbourne. Ursula did none of these things. Ursula craved solitude, but she hated loneliness, a conundrum that she couldn't even begin to solve. At work, they regarded her as a person apart, as if she were senior to them in every way, even though she wasn't. Occasionally one or other of the office coterie would say to her, "Do you want to come out with us after work?" It was meant kindly and felt like charity, which it probably was. She never took them up on their offers. She suspected, no, she knew, that they talked about her behind her back, nothing nasty, just curiosity really. They imagined there must be more to her. A dark horse. And still waters run deep. They would be disappointed to know that there was no more, that even clichés were more interesting than the life she lived. No depths, no darkness, in the past perhaps, but not the present. Unless you counted the drink. Which she supposed they would. The work was a chore, endless bills of lading and customs forms and balance sheets. The goods themselves, rum, cocoa, sugar, and the exotic places they came from seemed at odds with the daily tedium of the office. She supposed she was a little cog in the big wheel of empire. Nothing wrong with being a cog, Maurice said, himself a big wheel now in the home office. The world needs cogs. She didn't want to be a cog, but Belgravia seemed to have put paid to anything grander. Ursula knew how the drinking had started. Nothing dramatic, just something as small and domestic as a boeuf bourguignon, she had planned for Pamela when she came to stay for the weekend a few months ago. She was still working in the lab in Glasgow, and wanted to do some shopping for her wedding. Harold hadn't moved yet either, he was due to take up his post at the Royal London in a few weeks. "We'll have a nice weekend, just the two of us," Pamela said. "Hilda's away," Ursula lied easily. "Gone to Hastings for the weekend with her mother." There was no reason not to tell Pamela the truth of her arrangement with Hilda. Pamela had always been the one person she could be honest with, and yet something held her back. "Splendid," Pamela said. "I'll drag Hilda's mattress through to your bedroom, and it'll be like old times." "Are you looking forward to being married?" Ursula asked as they lay in bed. It wasn't really like old times at all. "Of course I am, why would I be doing it otherwise? I like the idea of marriage. There is something smooth and round and solid about it. Like a pebble," Ursula said. "A symphony. Well, more of a duet, I suppose. It's not like you to wax poetic. I like what our parents have, Pamela said simply. Do you? It was a while since Pamela had spent much time with Hugh and Sylvie. Perhaps she didn't know what they had these days. Dissonance rather than harmony. Have you met anyone? Pamela asked cautiously. No. No one. Not yet, Pamela said in her most encouraging manner. The Boeuf Bourguignon had, naturally, required Burgundy, and in her lunch hour Ursula had dropped into the wine merchant's that she passed every day on her way to work in the city. It was an ancient place, the wood of the interior gave the impression that it had been soaked in wine over the centuries, and the dark bottles with their beautiful labels seemed to hold out the promise of something that went beyond their contents. The wine merchant picked out a bottle for her. Some people used inferior wine for cooking, he said, but the only use one should have for inferior wine was vinegar. He himself was acerbic and rather overwhelming. He afforded the bottle the tenderness of care due a baby, lovingly wrapping it in tissue paper, and passing it to Ursula to cradle in her basket-weave shopper where her purchase remained concealed from the office during the afternoon, in case they suspected her of being a secret lush. The Burgundy was bought before the beef, and that evening Ursula thought she would open the wine and try a glass, seeing as it had been lauded so highly by the wine merchant. Of course, she'd had alcohol before, she was no teetotaler, after all, but she had never drunk alone. Never uncorked an expensive bottle of Burgundy, and poured a glass just for herself, dressing gown, curlers, a cozy gas fire. It was like stepping into a warm bath on a cold night, the deep, mellow wine suddenly enormously comforting. This was Keats's beaker full of the warm south, was it not? Her habitual despondency seemed to evaporate a little, so she had another glass. When she stood up she felt quite swimmy, and laughed at herself. Tiddly, she said to no one, and found herself wondering about getting a dog. It would be someone to talk to. A dog like Jock would greet her every day with cheerful optimism, and perhaps some of that would rub off on her. Jock was gone now, a heart attack, the vet said. And he had such a strong little heart, Teddy said, himself heartbroken. He had been replaced by a sad-eyed whippet that seemed too delicate for the rough and tumble of a dog's life. Ursula rinsed the glass and put the cork back in the bottle, leaving plenty for the beef tomorrow before tottering off to bed. She fell fast asleep and didn't wake until the alarm, which made a change from the usual restlessness. Drink and leave the world unseen. When she woke she realized that she couldn't possibly look after a dog. Next day at work, the tedium of filling in ledgers all afternoon was cheered by the thought of the half-bottle sitting on her kitchen draining board. After all, she could buy another bottle for the beef. That good, the wine merchant said when she appeared again 2 days later. No, she laughed, I haven't cooked the meal yet. It struck me that I should have something equally good to drink with it. She realized she couldn't come back here, to this lovely shop. There was a limit to how many Boeuf Bourguignons someone was likely to cook. For Pamela, Ursula made an abstemious cottage pie, followed by baked apples and custard. I brought you a present from Scotland, Pamela said, and produced a bottle of malt whiskey. Once the malt had been drunk she found another wine merchant, one who treated his wares with less veneration. For a Boeuf Bourguignon, she said, although he showed no interest in its purpose. I'll take 2, actually. I'm cooking for a lot of people. A couple of bottles of Guinness from the public house on the corner, for my brother, she said, he popped in unexpectedly. Teddy wasn't quite 18, she doubted he was a drinker. A couple of days later the same. Your brother round again, miss, the publican said. He winked at her and she flushed. An Italian restaurant in Soho, that she happened to be passing, happily sold her a couple of bottles of Chianti without question. Sherry from the wood, she could take a jug to the co-op at the end of the road, and they would fill it up from the barrel. For my mother. Rum from public houses a long way from the flat, for my father. She was like a scientist experimenting with the various forms of alcohol, but she knew what she liked best, that first bottle of blushful hippocrene, the blood-red wine. she plotted how to get a case delivered for a family celebration. She had become a secret drinker. It was a private act, intimate and solitary. The very thought of a drink made her heart thud with both fear and anticipation. Unfortunately, between the restrictive licensing laws and the horror of humiliation, a young woman from Bayswater could have considerable difficulty in supplying her addiction. It was easier for the rich. Izzy had an account somewhere, Harrods probably, that simply delivered the stuff to her door. She had dipped her toe in the waters of Lethe, and the next thing she knew she was drowning, from sobriety to being a drunkard in a matter of weeks. It was both shameful and a way of annihilating shame. Every morning she woke up and thought, not tonight, I won't take a drink tonight, and every afternoon the longing built as she imagined walking into her flat at the end of the day and being greeted by oblivion. She had read sensationalist accounts of the opium dens of Limehouse and wondered if they were true. Opium sounded better than Burgundy for eclipsing the pain of existence. Izzy could probably supply her with the location of a Chinese opium den. She had kicked the gong around, she had reported blithely, but it wasn't really the kind of thing Ursula felt she could ask. It might not lead to nirvana. She had proved an apt pupil of Dr. Kellett after all. It might lead to a new Belgravia. Izzy was occasionally allowed back into the family fold, weddings and funerals only, Sylvie said. Not christenings. She had been invited to Pamela's wedding, but to Sylvie's profound relief had sent her apologies. Weekend in Berlin, she said. She knew someone with a plane, thrilling, who was going to fly her there. Ursula visited Izzy occasionally. They had the horror of Belgravia in common, a memory that would unite them forevermore, although they never spoke of it. In her stead there was a wedding present, a box of silver cake forks, a gift that Pamela was amused by. How mundane, she said to Ursula. She never ceases to surprise. Nearly finished, the Neasden dressmaker said through a mouthful of pins. I suppose I am getting a bit plump, Ursula said, looking in the mirror at the yellow satin straining to accommodate her pot belly. Perhaps I should join the Women's League of Health and Beauty. Stone cold sober, she tripped on her way home from work. It was a miserable November evening a few months after Pamela's wedding, wet and dark, and she simply hadn't seen the pavement slab, the edge of which had been lifted slightly by a tree root. Her hands were full, books from the library and grocery shopping, all acquired hastily in a lunch hour, and her instinct was to save the groceries and the books rather than herself. The result was that her face slammed into the pavement, the full force taken by her nose. The pain stunned her. She had never experienced anything that came close to it before. She knelt on the ground and held her arms around herself, shopping and books now abandoned to the wet pavement. She could hear herself moaning, keening, and could do nothing to stop the noise. Oh my, a man's voice said, how awful for you. Let me help you. You have blood all over your nice peach scarf. Is that the color or is it salmon? Peach, Ursula murmured, polite despite the pain. She had never given much thought to the mohair muffler around her neck. There seemed to be a lot of blood. She could feel her whole face swelling and could smell the blood, thick and rusty, in her nose, but the pain had lessened a degree or two. The man was rather nice looking, not very tall, but he had sandy hair and blue eyes, and clean, polished-looking skin stretched over good cheekbones. He helped her to her feet. His hand in hers was firm and dry. My name's Derek, Derek Oliphant, he said. Elephant. Oliphant. 3 months later they were married. Derek's origins were in Barnet, and as unremarkable to Sylvie as Harold's before him. That was, of course, the essence of his appeal for Ursula. He taught history at Blackwood, a minor public school for boys, the children of aspirant shopkeepers, Sylvie said dismissively, and courted Ursula with concerts in the Wigmore Hall, and walks on Primrose Hill. They took long bike rides that ended up in pleasant pubs in the outer suburbs, a half pint of mild for him, a lemonade for her. Her nose proved to be broken. Oh, poor you, Pamela wrote. And you had such a nice nose. Before he escorted her to a hospital, Derek had led her into a public house nearby to get cleaned up a little. "Let me get you a brandy," he said when she sat down, and she said, No, I'm fine, I'll just have a glass of water." I'm not much of a drinker, even though the previous evening she had blacked out on the floor of her bedroom in Bayswater, courtesy of a bottle of gin she had stolen from Izzy's house. She had no qualms about thieving from Izzy. Izzy had taken so much from her. Belgravia, and so on. Ursula stopped drinking almost as suddenly as she had started. She supposed she had had a hollow inside her that had been scooped out in Belgravia. She had tried to fill it with alcohol, but now it was being replenished with her feelings for Derek. What were those feelings? Mostly relief that someone wanted to look after her, someone who knew nothing of her shameful past. "I'm in love," she wrote rather deliriously to Pamela. "Hurrah," Pamela wrote back. Sometimes, Sylvie said, one can mistake gratitude for love. Derek's mother still lived in Barnet, but his father was dead, as was a younger sister. "A horrible accident," Derek said. "She fell into the fire when she was 4 years old." Sylvie had always been very particular about fireguards. Derek himself had nearly drowned when he was a boy, he said, after Ursula had offered up her own incident in Cornwall. It was one of the few adventures in her life where she felt she had played an almost entirely innocent part. And Derek? A rough tide, an upturned rowing boat, and heroic swim to shore. No Mr. Winton necessary. "I rescued myself," he said. "He's not entirely ordinary then," Hilda said, offering Ursula a cigarette. She hesitated but declined, not ready to take on another addiction. She was in the middle of packing up her goods and chattels. She could hardly wait to leave Bayswater behind. Derek was in digs in Holborn, but was finalizing the purchase of a house for them. "I've written to the landlord, by the way," Hilda said. "Told him we're both moving out. Ernie's wife's giving him a divorce, did I say?" She yawned. "He's popped the question. Thought I might take him up on it. We'll both be respectable married women. I can come and visit you in, where is it again? Wealdstone." The wedding party, in a register office, was, according to Derek's wishes, restricted to his mother and to Hugh and Sylvie. Pamela was disconcerted not to be invited. "We didn't want to wait," Ursula said. "And Derek didn't want any fuss." "And don't you want fuss?" Pamela asked. "Isn't that the point of a wedding?" No, she didn't want a fuss. She was going to belong to someone, safe at last, that was all that counted. Being a bride was nothing, being a wife was everything. "We wanted it all to be simple," she said resolutely. "And cheap by the looks of it," Izzy said. Another set of mundane silver cake forks was dispatched. "He seems like a pleasant enough chap," Hugh said at what passed for a reception, a 3-course luncheon in a restaurant close to the register office. "He is," Ursula agreed. "Very pleasant. Still, it's a bit of a rum-do, little bear," Hugh said. "Not like Pammy's wedding, is it? Half of the old Kent Road seemed to turn out for that. And poor Ted was very put out not to be invited today. As long as you're happy, though," he added encouragingly, "that's the main thing." Ursula wore a dove-grey suit for the ceremony. Sylvie had provided corsages for everyone made from hothouse roses from a florist. "Not my roses, sadly," she said to Mrs. Oliphant. "Gloire Mao Sue, if you're interested." "Very nice, I'm sure," Mrs. Oliphant said, in a way that didn't sound much like a compliment. "Marry in haste, repent at leisure," Sylvie murmured to no one in particular before a restrained sherry toast to the bride and bridegroom. "Have you?" Hugh asked her mildly. "Repented?" Sylvie pretended not to hear. She was in a particularly discordant mood. "Change of life, I believe," an embarrassed Hugh whispered to Ursula. "Me too," she whispered back. Hugh squeezed her hand and said, "That's my girl. And does Derek know you're not intact?" Sylvie asked when she was alone with Ursula in the ladies' powder room. They were sitting on little padded stools, repairing their lipstick in the mirror. Mrs. Oliphant remained at the table, having no lipstick to repair. Intact. Ursula echoed, staring at Sylvie in the mirror. What did that mean, that she was flawed? Or broken? One's maidenhood, Sylvie said. Deflowering, she added impatiently when she saw Ursula's blank expression. For someone who is far from innocent, you seem remarkably naive. Sylvie used to love me, Ursula thought. And now she didn't. Intact, Ursula repeated again. She had never even considered this question. How will he tell? The blood, of course, Sylvie said, rather testily. Ursula thought of the wisteria wallpaper. The deflowering. She hadn't known there was a connection. She thought the blood was a wound, not the breaching of the arch. Well, he might not realize, Sylvie sighed. I'm sure he won't be the first husband to be deceived on his wedding night. Fresh war paint, Hugh said easily when they returned to the table. Ted had inherited Hugh's smile. Derek and Mrs. Oliphant shared the same frown. Ursula wondered what Mr. Oliphant had been like. He was seldom mentioned. Vanity, thy name is woman, Derek said with what seemed like a forced joviality. He was not, Ursula noticed, as comfortable in social situations as she had first thought. She smiled at him, feeling a new bond. She was marrying a stranger, she realized. Everyone marries a stranger, Hugh said. The word is frailty, actually, Sylvie said pleasantly. Frailty, thy name is woman. Hamlet. Many people misquote it for some reason. A shadow passed over Derek's face, but then he laughed it off. I bow to your superior learning, Mrs. Todd. Their new house in Wealdstone had been chosen for its location, relatively near to the school where Derek taught. He had an inheritance, a very small sum from his seldom-mentioned father's investments. It was a sound terrace in Mason's Avenue, half-timbered in the Tudor style, with leaded lights, and a stained glass panel in the front door depicting a galleon in full sail, although Wealdstone seemed a long way from any ocean. The house had all modern conveniences as well as shops close by, a doctor, a dentist and a park for children to play in fact everything a young wife and mother, one day very soon, according to Derek, could want. Ursula could see herself eating breakfast with Derek in the mornings before waving him off to work, could see herself pushing their children in prams then pushchairs then swings, bathing them in the evening and reading bedtime stories in their pretty bedroom. She and Derek would sit quietly in the lounge in the evenings listening to the wireless. He could work on the book he was writing, a school textbook from Plantagenets to Tudors. Gosh, Hilda said. Sounds thrilling. Wealdstone was a long way from Belgravia. Thank goodness. The rooms this married life was to be carried out in remained in her imagination until after their honeymoon, as Derek had bought and furnished the house without her ever having seen it. That's a bit odd, don't you think? Pamela said. No, Ursula said. It's like a surprise gift. My wedding present from him. When Derek finally carried her awkwardly over the Wealdstone threshold, a red-tiled porch that neither Sylvie nor William Morris would have approved of, Ursula couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment. The house proved to be more sparsely old-fashioned than the one in her imagination, and there was a drabness about it that she supposed came from its not having had a woman's hand in the decor. So she was surprised when Derek said, "Mother helped me." But then there was, of course, a similar kind of occlusion in Barnet, where a certain dinginess adhered to the Dowager Mrs. Oliphant. Sylvie had passed her honeymoon in Deauville, Pamela spent hers on a walking holiday in Switzerland, but Ursula began her own marriage with a rather wet week in Worthing. She married one man, a pleasant enough chap, and woke up with another, one as tightly wound as Sylvie's little carriage clock. He changed almost immediately, as if the honeymoon itself was a transition, an anticipated rite of passage for him from solicitous suitor to disenchanted spouse. Ursula blamed the weather, which was wretched. The landlady of the boarding house, where they were staying, expected them to vacate the premises between breakfast and dinner at 6, and so they spent long days sheltering in cafes, or in the art gallery and museum, or fighting the wind on the pier. Evenings were spent playing partner whist with other, less dispirited, guests before retiring to their chilly bedroom. Derek was a poor card player, in more ways than one, and they lost nearly every hand. He seemed almost to willfully misread her attempts to indicate her hand to him. "Why did you lead trumps?" she asked him later, genuinely curious, as they decorously removed their clothes in the bedroom. "You think that nonsense is important," he said with a look of such deep contempt that she thought it might be best to avoid games of any kind with Derek in the future. On the first night, blood, or the lack of it, passed unnoticed, Ursula was relieved to find. "I think you should know that I am not inexperienced," Derek said rather pompously as they climbed into bed together for the first time. "I believe it is the duty of a husband to know something of the world. How else can he protect the purity of his wife?" It sounded like a specious argument to Ursula, but she was hardly in a position to argue. Derek rose early each morning and did a relentless series of press ups, as if he were in an army barracks rather than on honeymoon. "Mens sana in corpora sana," he said. Best not to correct him, she thought. He was proud of his Latin, as well as his smattering of ancient Greek. His mother had scrimped and saved to make sure he had a good education. Nothing had been handed on a plate, unlike some. Ursula had been rather good at Latin, Greek too, but she thought it best not to crow. That was another Ursula, of course. A different Ursula, unmarked by Belgravia. Derek's method of having conjugal relations was very similar to his method of exercise, even down to the same expression of pain and effort on his face. Ursula could have been part of the mattress for all he seemed to care. But what did she have to measure it against? Howie. She wished now that she had questioned Hilda about what went on in her pleasure palace in Ealing. She thought of Izzy's exuberant flirting and the warm affection between Pamela and Harold. It all seemed to indicate diversion, if not downright happiness. "What's life worth if you can't have some fun?" Izzy used to say. Ursula sensed there was going to be a shortage of fun in Wealdstone. As humdrum as her job had been, it was as nothing compared to the drudge work of keeping house, day in, day out. Everything had to be continually washed, scrubbed, dusted, polished and swept, not to mention the ironing, the folding, the hanging, the straightening. The adjustments. Derek was a man of right angles and straight lines. Towels, tea towels, curtains, rugs all needed constant alignment and realignment, as did Ursula, apparently. But this was her job, this was the arrangement and realignment of marriage itself, wasn't it? Although Ursula couldn't get over the feeling that she was on some kind of permanent probation. It was easier to succumb to Derek's unquestioning belief in domestic order rather than to fight it. A place for everything and everything in its place. Crockery had to be scoured clean of stains, cutlery had to be polished and straightened in drawers, knives adjusted like soldiers on parade, spoons spooning each other neatly. A housewife has to be the most observant worshipper at the altar of the Lauries and Panades, he said. It should be hearth, not altar, she thought, the amount of time she spent sweeping out grates and rattling clinker out of the boiler. Derek was particular about tidiness. He couldn't think, he said, if things were out of place or askew. Tidy house, tidy mind, he said. Ursula was learning, rather fond of aphorisms. He certainly couldn't work on from Plantagenets to tutors in the kind of muddle that Ursula seemed to create simply by entering a room. They needed the income from this textbook, his first, which William Collins was to publish, and to this end he commandeered the poky dining room, table, sideboard and all, at the back of the house as his study, and Ursula was banished from Derek's company most evenings so that he could write. Two should live as cheaply as one, he said, and yet here they were, barely able to pay their bills because of her lack of domestic economy, so she could at least give him some peace to try to earn an extra crust. And no, thank you, he didn't want her help in typing up his manuscript. Ursula's old household routines now seemed appallingly slovenly, even to her own eyes. In Bayswater her bed often went unmade and her pots unwashed. Bread and butter made a good breakfast and there was nothing wrong, as far as she could see, with a boiled egg for tea. Married life was more exacting. Breakfasts had to be cooked and on the table at just the right time in the morning. Derek couldn't be late for school and regarded his breakfast, a litany of porridge, eggs and toast, as a solemn and solitary communion. The eggs were cooked in rotation throughout the week, scrambled, fried, boiled, poached, and on Fridays the excitement of a kipper. At weekends Derek liked bacon, sausage and black pudding with his eggs. The eggs came not from a shop but a small holding 3 miles away, to which Ursula had to trek on foot every week because Derek had sold their bikes when they moved to Wealdstone to save money. Tea was a different kind of nightmare, as she had to think of new things to cook all the time. Life was an endless round of chops and steaks and pies and stews and roasts, not to mention the pudding that was expected every day and in great variety. "I'm a slave to recipe books," she wrote with faux cheerfulness to Sylvie, although cheerful was far from how she felt every day, poring over their demanding pages. She gained a new respect for Mrs. Glover. Of course, Mrs. Glover benefited from a large kitchen, a substantial budget, and a full batterie de cuisine, whereas the Wealdstone kitchen was fitted out in a rather paltry fashion and Ursula's housekeeping allowance never seemed to stretch throughout the week, so that she was continually chastised for overspending. She had never bothered much about money in Bayswater. If she fell short she ate less and walked instead of taking the tube. If she really needed topping up there had always been Hugh or Izzy to fall back on, but she could hardly go running to them for money now that she had a husband. Derek would have been mortified at this slur on his manhood. After several months under the constraint of unending chores Ursula thought she might go mad if she couldn't find some kind of pastime to alleviate the long days. There was a tennis club that she passed en route to the shops every day. All she could see of it was the tall netting that rose behind a wooden fence, and a green door and a white pebble-dash wall facing the street, but she could hear the familiar inviting summer sound of thock and twang, and one day she found herself knocking on the green door and asking if she could join. "I've joined the local tennis club," she said to Derek when he came home that evening. "You didn't ask me," Derek said. "I didn't think you played tennis." "I don't," he said. "I meant you didn't ask me if you could join." "I didn't know I had to ask." Something passed over his face, the same cloud she had briefly seen on their wedding day when Sylvie had corrected his Shakespeare. This time it took longer to pass, and seemed to change him in some indefinable way, as though part of him had shriveled inside. "Well, can I?" she said, thinking it would be better to be meek and keep the peace. Would Pammy have asked such a question of Harold? Would Harold have ever expected such a question? Ursula wasn't sure. She realized she knew nothing about marriage. And of course, Sylvie and Hugh's alliance remained an ongoing enigma. She wondered what argument Derek could possibly have against her playing tennis. He seemed to be having the same struggle and eventually said begrudgingly, "I suppose so. As long as you still have time to do everything in the house." Halfway through their tea, stewed lamb chops and mashed potatoes, he got up abruptly from the table, picked up his plate, and threw it across the room, and then walked out of the house without saying a word. He didn't come back until Ursula was getting ready for bed. He still wore the same thrawn expression on his face, as when he had left and gave her a brief "good night" that almost choked him as they climbed into bed. In the middle of the night she was woken by him clambering on top of her, and hitching himself wordlessly inside her. Wisteria came to mind. The thrawn face, that look was how she thought of it, now made regular appearances and Ursula surprised herself with how far she would go to appease it. But it was hopeless. Once he was in this mood she got on his nerves, no matter what she did or said. In fact her attempts to placate him seemed to make the situation worse, if anything. A visit was arranged to Mrs. Oliphant in Barnet, the first since the wedding. They had popped in briefly, tea and a stale scone, to announce their engagement, but hadn't been back since. This time round Mrs. Oliphant fed them a limp ham salad and some small conversation. She had several odd jobs saved up for Derek and he disappeared, tools in hand, leaving his womenfolk to clear up. When the washing up was done, Ursula said, "Shall I make a cup of tea?" and Mrs. Oliphant said, "If you like," without any great encouragement. They sat awkwardly in the parlor, sipping their tea. There was a framed photograph hanging on the wall, a studio portrait of Mrs. Oliphant and her new husband on their wedding day, looking straight-laced in turn-of-the-century wedding garb. "Very nice," Ursula said. "Do you have any photographs of Derek when he was small? Or of his sister?" she added because it didn't seem right to exclude the girl from family history merely on account of her being dead. "Sister," Mrs. Oliphant said, frowning. "What sister?" "His sister who died," Ursula said. "Died?" Mrs. Oliphant looked startled. "Your daughter," Ursula said. "She fell in the fire," she added, feeling foolish. It was hardly a detail you were likely to forget. She wondered if perhaps Mrs. Oliphant was a little simple. Mrs. Oliphant herself looked confused, as if she were trying to recollect this forgotten child. "I only ever had Derek," she concluded firmly. "Well, anyway," Ursula said, as if this were a trivial subject to be lightly tossed away, "you must come and visit us in Wealdstone. Now that we're settled. We're very grateful, you know, for the money that Mr. Oliphant left." "Left?" "He left money. Some shares, I think, in the will," Ursula said. Perhaps Mrs. Oliphant hadn't been involved in the probate. "Will? He left nothing but debts when he went. He's not dead," she added as if it were Ursula who was the simple one. "He's living in Margate." What other lies and half-truths were there, Ursula wondered. Did Derek really nearly drown when he was younger? Drown? Fall out of a rowing boat and swim to shore? Whatever gave you that idea? "Now then," Derek said, appearing in the doorway and making them both jump, "what are you two gossiping about?" "You've lost weight," Pamela said. "Yes, I suppose I have. I've been playing tennis." How normal that made her life sound. She doggedly attended the tennis club. It was the only relief she had from the claustrophobia of life in Mason's Avenue, though she had to face a constant inquisition on the subject. Every evening when he came home, Derek asked if she had played tennis today, even though she only played 2 afternoons a week. She was always interrogated about her partner, a dentist's wife called Phyllis. Derek seemed to despise Phyllis, even though he had never met her. Pamela had traveled all the way from Finchley. "Obviously it was the only way I was ever going to see you. You must like married life. Or Wealdstone," she laughed. "Mother said that you put her off." Ursula had been putting everyone off since the wedding, rebuffing Hugh's offers to pop in for a cup of tea, and Sylvie's hints that perhaps they should be invited to Sunday lunch. Jimmy was away at school and Teddy was in his first year at Oxford, but he wrote lovely long letters to her, and Maurice, of course, had no inclination to visit anyone in his family. "I'm sure she's not too bothered about visiting Wealdstone and so on. Not her cup of tea at all." They both laughed. Ursula had almost forgotten what it felt like to laugh. She felt tears start to her eyes, and had to turn away and busy herself with the tea things. "It's so nice to see you, Pammy." "Well, you know you're welcome in Finchley whenever you please. You should get a telephone, and then we could talk all the time." Derek thought a telephone was an expensive luxury, but Ursula suspected that he simply didn't want her speaking to anyone. She could hardly voice this suspicion, and to whom? Phyllis. The milkman, as people would think she was off her head. Ursula had been looking forward to Pamela's visit the way people looked forward to holidays. On Monday she had said to Derek, "Pamela's coming on Wednesday afternoon," and he had said, "Oh." He seemed indifferent and she was relieved that the thrawn face did not appear. As soon as they were finished with them, Ursula quickly cleared the tea things away, washed and dried them, and put them back in their places. "Golly," Pamela said, "when did you become such a neat little housefrau?" Tidy house, tidy mind, Ursula said. Tidiness is overrated, Pamela said. Is anything the matter? You seem awfully down. Time of the month, Ursula said. Oh, rotten luck. I'm going to be free of that problem for a few months. Guess what? You're having a baby. Oh, that's wonderful news. Yes. Isn't it? Mother will be a grandmother again. Maurice had already made a start on the next generation of Todds. Will she like that, do you suppose? Who knows? She's rather unpredictable these days. Did you have a nice visit from your sister? Derek asked when he came home that night. Lovely. She's having a baby. Oh? The next morning her poached eggs were not up to scratch. Even Ursula had to admit that the egg she presented for Derek's breakfast was a sad sight, a sickly jellyfish deposited on toast to die. A sly smile appeared on his face, an expression that seemed to indicate a certain triumph in finding fault. A new look. Worse than the old. Do you expect me to eat that? He asked. Several answers to that question passed through Ursula's mind, but she rejected them all as provocative. Instead she said, I can do you another one. You know, he said, I have to work all hours at a job I despise, just to keep you. You don't have to worry your silly little noggin about anything, do you? You do nothing all day. Oh no, forgive me, he said sarcastically, I was forgetting you play tennis, and you can't even manage to cook me an egg. Ursula hadn't realized he despised his job. He complained a great deal about the behavior of the lower third, and talked incessantly about the headmaster's lack of appreciation of his hard work, but she hadn't thought that he hated teaching. He looked close to tears and she felt suddenly and unexpectedly sorry for him and said, I'll poach another. Don't bother. She anticipated the egg would be thrown at the wall. Derek was given to tossing food around since she had joined the tennis club, but instead he delivered a massive open-handed slap to the side of her head that sent her reeling against the cooker, and then to the floor where she remained, kneeling as though she were at prayer. The pain, more than the act, had taken her by surprise. Derek walked across the kitchen and stood over her with the plate containing the offending egg. For a moment she thought he was going to bring it crashing down on her, but instead he slid the egg off the plate, and onto the top of her head. Then he stalked out of the kitchen, and she heard the front door slam a minute later. The egg slid off her hair, down her face, and onto the floor, where it burst open in a quiet splash of yellow. She struggled to her feet, and fetched a cloth. That morning seemed to open up something in him. She broke rules she didn't know existed, too much coal on the fire, too much toilet paper used, a light accidentally left on. Receipts and bills were all scrutinized by him, every penny had to be accounted for, and she never had any spare money. He proved himself capable of the most enormous rants over the pettiest of things. Once started he seemed unable to stop. He was angry all the time. She made him angry all the time. Every evening now he demanded an exacting account of her day. How many books did she change in the library? What did the butcher say to her? Did anyone call at the house? She gave up tennis. It was easier. He didn't hit her again, but violence seemed to simmer constantly beneath his surface, a dormant volcano that Ursula had unwontedly brought back to life. She was wrong-footed by him all the time, so that she never seemed to have a moment to clear the befuddlement in her brain. Her very existence seemed to be irksome to him. Was life to be lived as a continuous punishment? Why not? Didn't she deserve that? She began to live in a strange kind of malaise, as though her head was full of fog. She had made her bed, she supposed, and now she must lie on it. Perhaps that was another version of Dr. Kellett's Amor Fati. What would he say about her current predicament? More to the point, perhaps, what would he say about Derek's peculiar character? She was to attend Sports Day. It was a big event in Blackwood's calendar, and wives of masters were expected to attend. Derek had given her money for a new hat and said, "Make sure you look smart." She went to a local shop that sold apparel for women and children, called a la mode, although it really wasn't. It was here that she bought her stockings and undergarments. She had had no new clothes since her wedding. She didn't care enough about her appearance to badger Derek for the money. It was a lackluster-looking shop in a row of other lackluster shops, a hairdressing salon, a fishmonger, a greengrocer's, a post office. She didn't have the heart or the stomach or the budget to bother going up to town to a smart London department store, and what would Derek say about such a jaunt? When she worked in London, before the watershed of marriage, she had spent a lot of time in Selfridge's and Peter Robinson's. Now those places seemed as distant as foreign countries. The contents of the shop window were protected from the sun by a yellowy-orange screen, a kind of thick cellophane that reminded her of the wrapper on a bottle of Lucozade, and made everything in the window completely undesirable. It was not the most beautiful hat, but she supposed it would do. She scrutinized her reflection unwillingly in the shop's floor-to-ceiling tripartite mirror. In triptych she looked 3 times worse than she did in the bathroom mirror, the only one in the house that she couldn't avoid. She no longer recognized herself, she thought. She had taken the wrong path, opened the wrong door, and was unable to find her way back. Suddenly, horribly, she frightened herself by wailing, the wretched sound of utter despondency. The owner of the shop came rushing from behind the counter and said, "There, dear, don't get upset. Time of the month, is it?" She made her sit and have a cup of tea and a biscuit, and Ursula couldn't begin to express her gratitude for this simple kindness. The school was one stop on the train, and then a short walk along a quiet road. Ursula joined the stream of parents flowing through Blackwood's gates. It was exciting, and slightly terrifying, to suddenly find herself among a crush. She had been married less than 6 months, but had forgotten what it was like to be in a crowd. Ursula had never been to the school before, and was surprised by its commonplace red brick, and its pedestrian herbaceous borders, quite unlike the ancient school that the men of the Todd family attended. Teddy and then Jimmy had followed in Morris's footsteps to Hugh's old school, a lovely building of soft grey stone, and as pretty as an Oxford college. Savage within, though, according to Teddy. The grounds were particularly beautiful, and even Sylvie admired the profusion of flowers in the beds. Rather romantic planting, she said. No such romance at Derek's school, where the emphasis was on the playing fields. The boys at Blackwood were not particularly academic, according to Derek anyway, and were kept occupied by an endless round of rugby and cricket. More healthy minds in healthy bodies. Did Derek have a healthy mind? It was too late to ask him about his sister and his father. Krakatoa would erupt, Ursula suspected. Why would you make up something like that? Dr. Kellett would know. Trestle tables, bearing refreshments for parents and staff, were set up at one end of the athletics field. Tea and sandwiches and finger slices of dry Dundee cake. Ursula lingered by the tea urn looking for Derek. He had told her he wouldn't be able to talk much to her as he was needed to help out, and when she did eventually spot him, at the far end of the field he was diligently carrying an armful of large hoops, the purpose of which seemed mysterious to Ursula. Everyone gathered around the trestles seemed to know each other, particularly the masters' wives, and it struck Ursula that there must be a great many more social events at Blackwood than Derek ever mentioned. A couple of senior masters, gowned like bats, settled on the tea table, and she caught the name Oliphant. As inconspicuously as possible Ursula stepped a little closer to them, pretending a deep fascination with the crab paste in the sandwich on her plate. Young Oliphant's in trouble again, I hear. Really? Hit a boy, I believe. Nothing wrong with hitting boys. I hit them all the time. Bad this time though, apparently. Parents are threatening to go to the police. He's never been able to control a class. Ruddy awful teacher, of course. Plates now fully loaded with cake, the 2 men began to wander off, Ursula drifting in their wake. In debt up to his ears, you know. Perhaps he'll make some money from his book. They both laughed heartily as if a great joke had been told. The wife's here today, I gather. Really? We'd better watch out. I hear she's very unstable. This, too, a great joke, seemingly. A sudden shot from the starting pistol signaling the beginning of a hurdles race made Ursula jump. She let the masters amble off. She had lost her appetite for eavesdropping. She caught sight of Derek striding towards her, hoops now replaced by an unwieldy burden of javelins. He shouted to a couple of boys for help, and they trotted up obediently. As they passed Ursula, one of them sniggered sotto voce, "Yes, Mr. Elephant, coming, Mr. Elephant." Derek dropped the javelins to the grass with a great clatter, and said to the boys, "Carry them to the end of the field, come on, get a move on." He approached Ursula and kissed her lightly on the cheek, saying, "Hello, dear." She burst out laughing, she couldn't help herself. It was the nicest thing he had said to her in weeks, and was voiced not to her, but for the benefit of the two masters' wives who were standing nearby. "Is there something funny?" he asked, studying her face a little too long for comfort. She could tell. He was seething. She shook her head in answer. She was worried she might scream out loud, could feel her own volcano bubbling up, ready to explode. She supposed she was hysterical. Unstable. "I have to see to the upper school's high jump," Derek said, frowning at her. "I'll meet you shortly." He walked off, still frowning, and she started to laugh again. "Mrs. Oliphant. Is it Mrs. Oliphant? It is, isn't it?" The two masters' wives pounced on her, lionesses sensing wounded prey. She also traveled home alone as Derek had to supervise evening study, and would eat at the school, he said. She made herself a scrappy tea of fried herring and cold potatoes, and had a sudden longing for a bottle of good red wine. In fact, one bottle after another until she had drunk herself to death. She scraped the herring bones into the bin. To cease upon the midnight with no pain. Anything was better than this ludicrous life. Derek was a joke to the boys, to the staff. Mr. Elephant. She could just imagine the unruly lower third driving him mad with rage. And his book, what of his book? Ursula never bothered much with the contents of Derek's study. She had never felt any great interest in the Plantagenets or tutors either, for that matter. She was under strict instructions not to move any of his papers or books when dusting and polishing in the dining room, as she still liked to think of it, but she didn't care to anyway, barely glancing at the progress of the great tome. He had been working feverishly of late. The table was covered in a clutter of notes and scraps of paper. It was all disconnected sentences and thoughts, rather amusing if somewhat primitive belief. Plantagenista, the common broom, gives us the name Angevin, come of the devil, and to the devil they would go. There was little sign of an actual manuscript, just corrections and recorrections, the same paragraph written over and over with tiny changes each time, and endless trial pages, written in ruled exercise books with Blackwood's crest and motto, a posse ad esse from possibility to reality on the cover. No wonder he hadn't wanted her to type up his manuscript. She had married a Kasayuban, she realized. Derek's whole life was a fabrication. From his very first words to her, "Oh my, how awful for you. Let me help you," he had not been genuine. What had he wanted from her? Someone weaker than himself. Or a wife, a mother of his children, someone running his house, all the trappings of the vie quotidienne, but without any of its underlying chaos. She had married him in order to be safe from that chaos. He had married her, she now understood, for the same reason. They were the last two people on earth who could make anyone safe from anything. Ursula rooted through the sideboard drawers and found a sheaf of letters, the top one with the letterhead of William Collins and Sons, Co. Ltd., regretfully rejecting his idea for a book, in an already oversubscribed area of history textbooks. There were similar letters from other educational publishers, and worse, there were unpaid bills and threatening final notices. A particularly harsh letter demanded immediate repayment of the loan taken out apparently to pay for the house. It was the kind of sour letter that she had typed up from dictation at her secretarial college. "Dear Sir, it has been brought to my notice." She heard the front door open, and her heart jumped. Derek appeared in the doorway of the dining room, a gothic intruder on stage. "What are you doing?" She held up the letter from William Collins and said, "You're a liar, through and through. Why did you marry me? Why did you make us both so unhappy?" The look on his face. That look. She was asking to be killed, but wasn't that easier than doing it herself? She didn't care anymore, there was no fight in her. Ursula was expecting the first blow, but it still took her by surprise, his fist punching hard into the middle of her face, as if he wanted to obliterate it. She slept, or perhaps she passed out, on the kitchen floor and woke some time before 6. She was sick and dizzy and every inch of her was sore and aching, her whole body made of lead. She was desperate for a drink of water, but didn't dare turn the tap on for fear of waking Derek. Using first a chair, then the table, she hauled herself up to standing. She found her shoes and crept into the hallway where she took her coat and a headscarf from the peg. Derek's wallet was in his jacket pocket and she took a 10-shilling note, more than enough for the rail fare, and then a cab onward. She felt exhausted just at the thought of this taxing journey. She wasn't even sure she could make it on foot as far as Harrow and Wealdstone Station. She slipped her coat on and pulled the headscarf over her face, avoiding the mirror in the hall stand. It would be too dreadful a sight. She left the front door slightly ajar in case the noise of it closing woke him up. She thought of Ibsen's Nora slamming the door behind her. Nora wouldn't have gone in for dramatic gestures if she had been trying to escape from Derek Oliphant. It was the longest walk of her life. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might give out. All the way she expected to hear his footsteps running up behind her, and him yelling her name. At the ticket office she had to mumble Euston, through a mouthful of bloody, broken teeth. The ticket clerk glanced at her, and then glanced quickly away when he saw the state she was in. Ursula supposed he had no precedent for dealing with female passengers who looked as if they had been in bare-knuckle fights. She had to wait for the first train of the day for another 10 agonizing minutes in the ladies' waiting room, but at least she was able to get a drink of water and remove some of the dried blood from her face. In the carriage she sat with her head bowed, one hand shielding her face. The men in suits and bowlers studiously ignored her. As she waited for the train to pull away she risked a glance along the platform, and was relieved beyond measure that there was still no sign of Derek. With any luck he hadn't missed her yet, and was still doing his press ups on the bedroom floor, presuming her to be down in the kitchen preparing his breakfast. Friday, Kipper Day. The kipper still lay on the pantry shelf, wrapped in newspaper. He would be furious. When she got off the train at Euston her legs almost gave way. People gave her a wide berth and she worried that the cab driver would refuse the fare, but when she showed him the money he took her. They drove in silence across London, bathed in rain overnight, and now the stones of the buildings were sparkling in the first rays of sun, and the soft cloudy dawn was opalescent in pinks and blues. She had forgotten how much she liked London. Her heart rose. She had decided to live, and now she wanted to very much. The cab driver helped her out at the end of the journey. "You're sure about this, miss, are you?" he said, looking doubtfully at the large red brick house in Melbury Road. She nodded, mutely. It was an inevitable destination. She rang the bell and the front door opened. Izzy's hand flew to her mouth in horror at the sight of her face. "Oh my God. What happened to you?" "My husband tried to kill me." "You'd better come in then," Izzy said. The bruises healed, very slowly. "Battle scars," Izzy said. Izzy's dentist fixed Ursula's teeth, and she had to wear her right arm in a sling for a while. Her nose had been broken again, and her cheekbones and jaw cracked. She was flawed, no longer intact. On the other hand, she felt as if she had been scourged clean. The past no longer weighed so heavily on the present. She sent a message to Fox Corner saying that she had gone away for the summer, a touring holiday of the Highlands with Derek. She was fairly sure that Derek wouldn't contact Fox Corner. He would be licking his wounds somewhere. Barnet, maybe. He had no idea where Izzy lived, thank goodness. Izzy was surprisingly sympathetic. "Stay as long as you like," she said. "It'll make a change from rattling around in here on my own. And God only knows I've got more than enough money to keep you. Take your time," she added. "No rush. And you're only 23, for heaven's sake." Ursula didn't know which was more surprising, Izzy's genuine hospitality, or the fact that she knew how old she was. Perhaps Izzy had been changed by Belgravia too. Ursula was in on her own one evening, when Teddy turned up on the doorstep. "You're hard to find," he said, giving her an enormous hug. Ursula's heart bumped with pleasure. Teddy always seemed more real than other people somehow. He was brown and strong from spending the long summer vacation working on the Hall farm. He had announced recently that he wanted to be a farmer. "I'll have the money back that I spent on your education," Sylvie said, but smiling because Teddy was her favorite. "I believe it was my money," Hugh said. "Did Hugh have a favorite?" "You, I think," Pamela said. "What happened to your face?" Teddy asked her. "Bit of an accident, you should have seen it before," she laughed. "You're not in the Highlands," Teddy said. "Doesn't seem so, does it? You've left him then?" "Yes." "Good." Teddy, like Hugh, didn't go in for long narratives. "Where's the giddy aunt then?" he asked. "Out giddying. The Embassy Club, I believe." They drank some of Izzy's champagne to celebrate Ursula's freedom. "You'll be disgraced in Mother's eyes, I expect," Teddy said. "Don't worry, I believe I already am." Together they made an omelette and a tomato salad, and ate with their plates on their knees listening to Ambrose and his orchestra on the wireless. When they finished their food, Teddy lit a cigarette. "You're so grown up these days," Ursula laughed. "I have muscles," he said, demonstrating his biceps like a circus strongman. He was reading English at Oxford and said it was a relief to stop thinking, and be working on the land. He was writing poetry, too, he said. About the land, not about feelings. Teddy's heart had been fractured by Nancy's death, and once a thing was cracked, he said, it could never be repaired perfectly. "Quite James Sheon, isn't it?" he said ruefully. Ursula thought of herself. A bereft Teddy carried his wounds on the inside, a scar across his heart where little Nancy Shawcross had been ripped away. "It's as if," he said to Ursula, "you walk into a room and your life ends but you keep on living." "I think I understand." "I do," Ursula said. Ursula dozed off with her head on Teddy's shoulder. She was still tremendously tired. "Sleep is a great healer," Izzy said, bringing her breakfast on a tray every morning. Eventually, Teddy sighed and stretched and said, "I suppose I should be getting back to Fox Corner." "What's the story, did I see you? Or are you still in Brigadoon?" He took their plates through to the kitchen. "I'll clear up while you think about your answer." When the doorbell rang, Ursula presumed it was Izzy. Now that Ursula was living in Melbury Road, she had grown careless about her door keys. "But you're always here, darling," she said when Ursula had to crawl out of bed at 3 in the morning to let her in. It wasn't Izzy, it was Derek. She was so surprised she couldn't even speak. She had left him so firmly behind that she thought of him as someone who had ceased to exist. He didn't belong in Holland Park, but rather in some dark place of the imagination. He twisted her arm behind her back and frog-marched her down the hall into the drawing room. He glanced at the coffee table, a heavy wooden thing carved in the Oriental style. Seeing the empty champagne glasses still sitting on the coffee table, and the big onyx ashtray containing Teddy's cigarette stubs, he hissed, "Who's been here with you?" He was incandescent with rage. "Who have you been fornicating with?" "Fornicating," Ursula said, surprised by the word. So biblical. Teddy came into the room, a dish towel casually over his shoulder. "What's all this?" he said, and then, "Get your hands off her." "Is this him?" Derek asked Ursula. Is this the man you're whoring around London with? And without waiting for an answer he smashed her head onto the coffee table, and she slid to the ground. The pain in her head was terrible and grew worse rather than lessened, as if she were in a vice being tightened all the time. Derek lifted the heavy onyx ashtray high as if it were a chalice, careless of the cigarette butts that showered onto the carpet. Ursula knew her brain wasn't working properly because she should have been cowering in terror, but all she could think about was that this was rather like the incident with the poached egg, and how silly life was. Teddy yelled something at Derek and Derek threw the ashtray at him instead of breaking open Ursula's skull with it. Ursula couldn't see whether or not the ashtray hit Teddy because Derek grabbed her by her hair, lifted her head up and cracked it back onto the coffee table. A bolt of lightning flashed in front of her eyes, but the pain began to fade. She slipped down onto the carpet, unable to move. There was so much blood in her eyes that she could barely see. The second time that her head hit the table she had felt something give way, the instinct to life perhaps. She knew from the awkward shuffling and grunting dance on the carpet around her that Derek and Teddy were fighting. At least Teddy was on his feet, and not lying unconscious, but she didn't want him to fight, she wanted him to run away, out of harm's way. She didn't mind dying, she really didn't, as long as Teddy was safe. She tried to say something but it came out as guttural nonsense. She was very cold and tired. She remembered feeling this way in the hospital, after Belgravia. Hugh had been there, he had held onto her hand, and kept her in this life. Ambrose was still on the wireless, Sam Brown was singing, "The sun has got his hat on." It was a jolly song to leave life to. Not what you expected. The black bat was coming for her. She didn't want to go. The blackness edged around her. Easeful death. It was so cold. It will snow tonight, she thought, even though it isn't winter yet. It was already snowing, cold flakes dissolving on her skin like soap. Ursula put out a hand for Teddy to hold, but this time nothing could stop her fall into the dark night.